Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to Scholar and Gentlemen. Living rooms around the country. We're back to discuss Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, Chapter 11. Book 11. Brother Ivan. And I have to say, in a lot of ways, this is quite probably the most terrifying section of the book. Like, there's just all sorts of psychological breakdown happening, and the actual murder revealed, and it's kind of like a frightening section of the book to me. It was also a huge chunk. I do apologize for not breaking that up. That one kind of slipped past me. But there's a lot to talk about. We may not go in as much depth on every single chapter here because I want to make sure we arrive at the devil chapter with like lots of energy and momentum left, because I think that one's pretty fascinating. So maybe we can like go rather quickly through these first couple kind of lighthearted chapters, even though one of them is a Kokokov chapter.
Nothing goes quickly.
So the At Grushenka's chapter, I thought, what jumps out at me most there is two facts. One is how Grushenka is described as having this sort of serious, new and serious demeanor. It seems like a kind of turn for her. And then the other thing is just how incredibly jealous everybody is all of a sudden in this chapter too. It's like now all this jealousy is flying around like crazy. So you guys have any comments on Grushenka?
Yeah.
About sorry, go ahead.
She certainly, some of the changes that have taken place as she's been with Dmitri as he's going through this trauma and gone through herself seem to have stuck somewhat. I thought it was interesting that she's taking care of Maximov, who,
yeah,
I know he's shown up a few times. He was playing cards, but he was also the one that Ivan like booted out of the carriage at the beginning of the book. And so I thought it was a nice contrast that she's taking care of this like terrible, dirty, kind of silly old man, as opposed to Ivan's kind of casual.
Can you guys hear Jason?
Cruelty. Ooh, am I not coming through? No. Cool. Well, that's pretty much all I had to say. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add to that. I think it is interesting, as Jason points out, that she's now taking care of Maximov because, earlier in the book, earlier in her life, she was in a position where she sort of needed to be taken care of by others, and now she's able to do that for somebody else, which is interesting. Also, just in terms of her emotions, I mean, we debated every time she showed up previously, what are her real feelings? Is she really stringing people around? Does she really love them or not? And I think we can really see character growth now and see where her feelings have grown.
And it leaves her vulnerable, right? And I'm looking at her evolution, and yeah, I was going to say things stuck to the wall a little bit. But the transition with that is now she's worried, now she's vulnerable, she's afraid now of Katerina instead of the other way around. And then there was, I love the wit and the humor in this book. And there's a little thing here where the Poles are begging her for money, and they write these like flowery letters that like, where the floweriness and pompousness stays consistent, but they ask for diminishing sums in each subsequent letter. I was laughing out loud while I was reading that section.
Hello?
Yeah, until it gets down to like 3 rubles or something like that.
Well, lengthy letter you need the thesaurus for.
I also thought it made her transformation more believable, that it wasn't complete, right? It wasn't a total snap of the finger and now Grushenka's quote-unquote good. Like these moments where she gets really mad and she's like, oh, I'm going to torment Dmitri now. Like, I don't know. The fact that the jealousy is flying around for so many of them. I think, like you said, Aaron, part of it's vulnerability. And I feel like part of it is Dostoevsky showing us again, like, it's not like you just wake up one day and you've like had a change of heart and now you're a good person, right? She wants to do good things, but she also kind of wants to piss Dmitri off by sending money and whatever these little food things are to the Poles, right? Like, ooh, he thought I sent them snacks, so I'm gonna send them snacks. Like, are they the same things as pierogies? That's what I was trying to figure out. Oh.
I just looked it up because I couldn't remember. Like, I know I was fed this in seminary, but there's some sort of pastry puff that's stuffed with various types of fillings.
I want one.
Yeah, so not like a pierogi where it's like more like a noodle. It's more like a bread thing full of stuff.
Worth getting jealous over.
I feel jealous right now. I want it.
I thought there was one kind of little philosophical line in here that was kind of nice from Grushenka when Maximov, you know, he's being scolded like he's not getting some pierogi and he won't get his little drop either. He kind of like does this over saccharine, oh, I'm nothing. You do better to lavish your benefactions on those who are more useful than I. And Grushenka says, everyone is useful, Maximushka. And how can anyone say who is more useful?
Well, I think too, yeah, that's, I mean, for a minor character, that's a pretty interesting transformation that so far Maximov has just kind of been the fool, right? Like getting kicked out of carriages and drunkenly staggering around parties he doesn't really belong. And now Grushenka says that like she wouldn't have made it through these past few weeks without having him to take care of and having someone to talk to. Like he literally is useful to her in that having a person she can talk to has been good. Sorry, Janae, I spoke over you, I think.
Your mic isn't on if you are trying to say something.
No, it was somebody else.
Okay. So the other thing we learned is that there's some sort of secret, and she thinks it's about Katya. All right, so let's go ahead and move on.
Well, I think there's one other thing I just wanted to mention is we have her talking about Dmitri going on this rant about why is the wee one poor? For the wee one, I'll go to Siberia. That was the one thing I had actually marked in this chapter.
Yeah, and she doesn't have a clue what he's talking about.
Right.
Because we can hear how coherent he is later when he talks to Alyosha.
Now, my memory sort of failed me. That wee one, that's a callback to his dream from a couple of books ago. Okay.
Yeah, the dream he had while he was, I believe, in the coach that was taking him back to town after he was arrested.
Okay.
And he had a dream about a village that was kind of all burned out, and they were starving, and you know the babies crying.
Yeah, and the mother was starving. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I sort of remembered it, but I just wanted to make sure I was, you know, making the right connection. I also, in this chapter, is the first time that it's mentioned about the lawyer and the doctor they're bringing in, basically wanting to mount an insanity defense for Mitya.
Right.
And I thought that was interesting. You know, I mean, the only things I know about the court system are from, you know, like terrible dramas on television, but like the insanity defense kind of seems to me like I would have thought it would have been more recent than this, and it's interesting to know that that was, and it sounds like the way they talk about it later that it's a fairly new idea. In Russian courts.
I thought I was a little surprised by that too. That was historically available at the time. Okay, so we're open for comment on Chapter 2, An Ailing Little Foot. I'll just highlight my favorite Koklakov line right off the bat. Page 572, when she's wandering around all over the place. The main thing is not to forget the main thing.
On that page, I like underlined double when she crossed herself. I'm like, well, I guess she's religious again.
Oh, and about the other Zosima too. Like
on the next page, when she says she's terribly fond of rumors, so she subscribes to rumors.
She's also a big fan of Fleetwood Mac. Yeah. On 572, I love. They say she's become a saint, though it's a bit late. She'd have better done it before when it was needed. Which there's some truth to also.
There's also a footnote from this part on the bottom of 573. I'm not even going to try and pronounce it, but they said the name of the town for the first time. And the narrator's like, oh, I've been concealing it all this time. According to the footnote, it roughly translates to Cattle Roundupville. So it's, Cowtown. Cowtown, Russia.
I was hoping everyone had caught that note because you had to read the footnotes to find that out. By the way, and I'll just pronounce it for you, Skotoprigonievsk.
The more you know.
Okay, so is anyone else a little bit surprised when Rakitin suddenly shows up writing poetry to her?
Yeah.
He's talking to the papers. He's writing her poems, and she thinks two young guys are in love with her. I just literally love these 3 pages. Also, it's the only time in the entire book I've seen Alyosha get upset. And he says straight up, "We're not friends." I would never have anticipated him saying something like that.
Yeah, we're not friends.
I mean, for me, that's that's nothing. But reading that had the same impact for me as hearing my grandma swear.
Yeah, Rakitin, no, fuck that guy.
Exactly.
I really liked the newspaper sort of digression about all the different articles that have been written.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of this chapter has kind of meta-textual trickery about what's real and what's not and what do we understand and what's literary and whatnot. But I like that in world people are also trying to figure out what all of these people are about and what their motivations are, and they're as captivated as we are nominally.
How about when Madame Koklakov decides it's Grigory who killed Fyodor? He's so sure of it. But why? He had a bit of passion. And then she goes on for a while, but these fits of passion.
Does anyone know anything about the new courts or what the social constructs or what that is? What is an institution?
Are these the ecclesiastical courts that Yvonne was kind of responding to?
I don't know.
At the beginning?
I think these are actually the civil courts that have been separated from the ecclesiastical. So now this is strictly a secular court system or whatever. But I don't know the real history there.
I mean, I don't know the history there, but that would make sense given that she's talking about all of these defenses they'll be able to use or, various things they'll be able to try in these new courts.
I love her description of the whole idea too on 578. And moreover, who isn't in a fit of passion these days? You, me, we're all in a fit of passion. There are so many examples. A man sits singing some old song, and suddenly something annoys him. He takes out a gun and shoots whoever happens to be there, and then they all forgive him.
And this is a validation of the new courts. I mean, is he, is the author mocking this new social institution, or why here?
I mean, I read the fit of passion kind of digression about, that's kind of connected to the courts. I mean, almost as it's played for comedy, but it's also pretty closely tied to kind of the general themes of like forgiveness and how do you treat someone who's done something sort of unforgivable. And one of the things that jumped out to me is that she's talking about the fit of passion, and that's how you forgive people. And you're like, well, it wasn't really your fault. And I think we get secondhand that Rakuten, it's like, well, it's your circumstances. It's not really your fault. There's another way of sort of coping with that. So I read it as more, I don't know, about existential. How do we handle existential guilt rather than legal guilt? But
it's also a certain echo and parody of Ivan's Grand Inquisitor idea, and his whole ecclesiastical courts argument from earlier, where it was like, how do you really get someone is to forgive them and hold their conscience or relationship with God is the big thing that you threaten them with or whatever, as opposed to like a physical punishment or whatever. I can't remember his argument very well, but some echo of that too, in a kind of, again, a sort of comic Shakespearean lower class way here.
Because I'm trying to remember what she was saying. It was something to the effect that it'd be better if it was Dmitri, so that this could substantiate and validate the new court system or something. I was like, oh, it's better. I didn't know there was a rank ordering of who you want to be murderers. It makes me laugh.
Shall we move on?
To the teenager?
What?
The most teenager of all time?
Yeah.
Personally, I find A Little Demon to be the most terrifying chapter in the entire book.
Yeah.
This one is really troubling to me.
I haven't talked yet, but it gives me sweat. I literally woke up in a cold sweat a number of times because of this chapter. It not only terrifies me, I don't drink, and it wants to drive me to drink. I swear this is going to happen to me, and I fear that one of these days this is going to happen to me.
So this is one of the great mysteries of the whole novel to me. What in the world is going on with Lise? She's always been kind of neurotic, but here is sort of full-blown, she's just become evil. She's suddenly rejected Alyosha for no apparent reason. I'm always asking myself, what did I miss? What changed in Lise that suddenly she's like, I want to burn the earth, and I want to set things on fire and kill kids, does anyone have any sort of plausible hypothesis of where this came from?
You got on with the goth kids? No, absolutely not.
She seems to be having some momentary obsession with Yvonne. That's my theory about where it came from. She has this whole thing about how she called Alyosha to her, and she's going to hate him someday because she's going to make him carry letters to the man she fell in love with later. And then she asked him to carry a letter to Yvonne, and she talks about a bunch of ideas that sound like they're straight out of Yvonne's weird musings. I don't know. Like, I don't know how she got, and it doesn't seem like they've had a number of conversations, but it feels like somehow his ideas got to her. Maybe because Rakitan's been hanging around the house. I don't know. She seems to have like tapped into some of these same ideas, and then she wanted to tell Yvonne about them, and he was like, "Yes, that's very good," and that set off some weird spiral on her. And we never know what the letter said because in coming chapters, Yvonne just rips it up, so we don't know what she actually said.
Also really irritating. I will submit my one little detail that I'm pretty sure no one else will have noticed who hasn't reread this book twice in a row and been wondering what is up with this girl. But I noticed in one of the earlier chapters where we meet her, she makes some side comment to Alyosha where she says, I don't like your brother Ivan. It just kind of comes out of nowhere. But he's not nicer. I don't remember what she says exactly, but she says, I don't like him. She singles him out sort of out of the blue for no apparent reason. And so you wonder what in the world contact have they had, and why she even knows about him at all. But there's a disturbing mixture of like of kind of very revealing honesty that's an accurate assessment of human nature mixed with what seems to be complete breakdown and madness, or I don't know if that's accurate, but like rebellion, outright rebellion. I think it is fairly insightful when she says at the top of 583, listen, your brother's on trial now for killing his father, and they all love it that he killed his father. You know, it's like the best possible thing to be shocked and horrified at, but everyone kind of likes being shocked and horrified about it, you know?
And yeah, and even Alyosha acknowledges that that's not a crazy thing to say.
Right. I'm really reminded for some reason of the character of the Joker in Dark Knight, you know, like someone who just kind of wants to watch the world burn, seems to be who she's become, like just creating and sowing chaos. Like I want to do bad things and I want to get caught, you know.
Chaotic evil.
What'd you say, Aaron?
Chaotic evil.
There's all kinds of crazy psychology here. Okay. We got to talk about the compote. This is the most terrifying thing in the whole chapter, in the whole book, even, I think. So this crazy racist story about a Jew crucifying kids, and then she's like, and I wish and I imagine being there and like looking on and just eating pineapple compote, and this it's just so this is so creepy, this sentence. Like the boy was moaning, but he kept moaning. He stood and admired it. That's good. Good? Good. Sometimes I imagine that it was I who crucified him. He hangs there moaning, and I sit down facing him eating pineapple compote. I like pineapple compote very much. Do you? It reminds me of very much actually of Yvonne's rebellion story about the Turks who are throwing babies up onto bayonets and stuff. And he goes through all their atrocities and he says, by the way, the Turks are very fond of sweets.
It seems like one idea that this novel keeps engaging with is like people who are I don't know the right language for this. Trying on evil sounds weird, but I feel like that's kind of what it is, right? Like there's this real parallel. I mean, I'm spoilering for the rest of this section, so I think that's fine. But I feel like there's such a parallel between Smerdyakov, who it becomes more and more clear probably killed Fyodor and did it because of Ivan's ideas. And now Ivan's ideas like somehow have got Lise in this state of like you know what I mean? I feel like this is the Grand Inquisitor played out like through a teenage girl's eyes, right? Like being really horrified, and you go like I feel like that's where you're right, Aaron, and saying this is like so teenager like, where some people are just like they're exposed to evil for the first time, and you do something really creepy and horrible with it because you don't know, and you're like trying to figure it out. I'm not saying that to excuse her. I just feel like there's like some way that just like Smerdyakov, she's like, there's these ideas. What would it be like to actually act them out? And I feel I'm also thinking just like that's Crime and Punishment, right? For anyone who's read that book, is like the character who's like, maybe I'll just try evil to see what evil is like.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a thing that happens in multiple Dostoevsky stories, I think.
I was going to say that reading this, for me, the parallels, first of all, like he's writing the sadistic evil, like, archetype of how to, like, write dialogue for someone who's sadistically evil.
Yeah.
And also, this reminded me in college of when guys I knew read Nietzsche for the first time. And it just, like, it just immediately went to like 11 out of 10 on the this is an okay scale.
When who read Nietzsche?
Guys I knew in college.
Oh, yeah.
College boy reading Nietzsche is such a thing.
Dorm room Nietzsche, yeah. And, she has that, like, I read a thing, now my not developed brain is taking it all the way to 11 out of 10.
Can we talk about this little passage where, okay, she's invited Yvonne because she's had this whole thing. And by the way, the fact that she shook with tears the whole night after she heard about this thing, it's like she seems a little bit torn. Like, she's also shocked and suffering from this idea, but she's strangely attracted to it, whatever. So, she has Yvonne come over and tells him the whole thing, including her, I imagine myself eating pineapple compote. And he suddenly laughed and said it was indeed good. Then he got up and left. Like, what? He said that was good? And then, what about this question, did he despise me? Was he laughing at me? And Alyosha's response, like, what do you guys make of this interaction with Yvonne? Like, Yvonne actually shows up. This isn't just hearsay or whatever at this point.
I think that we've talked about this theme a lot of how do you deal with suffering, and how do you explain it? And here's this girl it looks like she's really trying to figure it out, and she's already got this disposition that is explosive, and her way of dealing with suffering is like, I'm going to steer all the way into it and I'll cause it to the most innocent. Like, this was like the extreme over and over in this section, but this is like an extreme way that Yvonne's approach can go horribly wrong. I didn't say that right.
Thank you for that.
Oh, you did.
Well, and I think maybe.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I think maybe it's not just Yvonne's approach going horribly wrong, but sorry, I had this like thought and then I always have trouble expressing it. I think it can be very typical of, I was going to say teenage rebellion, but I mean anybody. It doesn't have to be a teenager. The kind of combination and the conflict between Yvonne's, it doesn't matter and do whatever, everything's permissible, and the strict moral black and white morality code that you've kind of been grown up with. And when you rebel against that, without going into a lot of personal detail, I sort of had a weird teenage rebellion thing going on when I was in college, at a conservative Christian college, and all of a sudden saw myself as this terrible, horrible person. And it was really conflicting, because on the one hand, I'm like, well, what I'm doing to rebel isn't that big a deal, shouldn't be a big deal, shouldn't matter. But on the other hand, all of a sudden, I was the most terrible person, and because I did that thing, I should do other terrible things. And I don't think I took it, obviously, to these extremes. But I think that kind of internal conflict is a real, more common than most people want to admit thing.
Micah, you had something you were going to share?
Yeah, I think one of the essential elements, why it's disturbing, and it's something that Dostoevsky is getting at really, really well. And it's, like you did a really great callback when you said, the Turks love sweets as well. It's and as Aaron put when he said, referring to it as chaotic evil, I'm not at all familiar with how character alignments work, but I think that one of the interesting things about evil in Dostoevsky versus just say, like an idea gone bad, like I think the difference, say maybe between Ivan and Smerdyakov, is capriciousness. And I think that capriciousness is what's so disturbing. Because on one hand, right, like, isn't it interesting how the whole scene is so terrifying and disturbing in itself, but then when you add the capriciousness in, then all of a sudden, right, it's like, because we hear all the time about, like, the poor people who were murdered in their homes. When you hear that the guy was wearing a Santa Claus costume, now all of a sudden we're mortified. And I think the reason for that is, and I think what Dostoevsky's trying to get at, is that for because the whole reason I think, like, Ivan, like, the reason why he leaves and the reason why he leaves amused is because of, it's not because of the horror of it. It's because if he's already kind of trapped and he believes to a certain extent that a lot of this is absurd and can't be justified, it's the capriciousness, right? Like, he sees kind of the whole thing as this horror. And then when someone else sees the capriciousness, I think it's a tip to the absurdity of it. And I think that's the thing. Like, oftentimes, like, it's so easy to, it's so easy to talk about the Turks like they're devils, right? Like, people have done that for forever. But I think, like, what Dostoevsky's trying to get at is that in order to break out of that, in order to break out of the way we really oftentimes think about and are confronted by evil, to think about the fact that evil, as being presented here, it's not even so much about, like, the inversion of values as much as the utter, as just much the utter rejection of value, right? Like, and I think that's the thing. Like, I mean, would we be less horrified if, it was a guy with a silencer who just put 2 bullets, in the head rather than a crucifixion? I think we would. I think it would horrify us a lot less because, we think to ourselves, murder is terrible, but what's worse is when people also suffer indignity. And I think that's the thing. Like, when a person, I think, like, whether it be struggling Ivan or, this struggling poor, I think partly disturbed girl, like, that's the thing. Like, there's this thing that happens where, for some reason, when they're confronting absurdity, they don't have the same sense of dignity. And I think that's where kind of some of the capriciousness and the appreciation for it, because to them, I don't think they see it so much as something that's fundamentally horrifying as much as fundamentally unmasking, because someone brought up the Joker, and the purpose of that character trope, I think C.S. Lewis called him the Savage, is the purpose of the Savage is to show that the conventional Tao, the idea of the transcendent good, is just a mask. And it's really just all power and caprice. And I think that's the whole thing. Like, I think it's funny because we're so used to dealing with, like, the serious challenges to civilization. We're so used to dealing with evil. But then when it becomes with the caprice, right? Like, I don't know, it's the caprice that disturbs us. Because we can't understand it precisely because it is absurd. And, like, that's why I get the sweats, because, like, even though I want to believe that the world has a certain sense of order and morality to it, you just can't help but wake up with the sweats and go, if there really is no moral order to the universe, we could just be eating pineapple, and that is the disturbing part, because, like, everything about my humanity just screams against it. So it's not just a challenge to good, it's like a challenge to, like, humanity itself that gets, like, it's why it makes my skin crawl. I think this isn't just about good and evil here. I think Dostoevsky is trying to define what a human being is, and I think Dostoevsky is trying to show us that a good human being, like, is not capricious in this way. Like, this is kind of what defines maturity, is even if you do bad things, you're not going to do bad things capriciously. You're not going to have this, like, this is the difference, right? This is what makes someone truly human, is they're not going to be capricious in this way. Not that they're not going to do bad things.
I also, like, there's so much to run with there, so I'm just going to kind of connect where I can. I'm also wondering if we're seeing another version of the sort of ripple effects we keep talking about, right? Whether or not Yvonne ever sat down and, like, laid everything out for Elise. I think Yvonne was trying to do some of what you were just saying, Michael. Like, he was telling us these increasingly horrifying, equally terrible stories to unmask, right? To try and show, to make some sort of point. But the ripple effect is that a young woman hears these stories and gets really messed up by them to the point where she's shaking and crying all night. And then in the next day, and this is just my pop psychology, right? But sometimes we deal with intense trauma by trying to, like, take control of it, right? I hear about all these horrible things. Well, I'm going to make myself the perpetrator in my imagination rather than the victim, which I feel like it's interesting that we haven't talked about yet. Like, Lise can walk now, right? Like, she's literally gone from being this sort of angelic, idealized victim to try and figuring out her agency and autonomy. And so it's like we're seeing this weird ripple effect where someone was trying to make a point, and then instead it had this effect. And I feel like that's partly why Alyosha freaks out when he hears that Yvonne came and said that, right? I think partly this is also a marker to help us see just how badly off Yvonne is, right? That he could come, see this girl have this reaction, and just be like that. Like, there's a real banality to his response. Like, all of us are horrified, and he's just like, good, that's good. I have to go back home and chat with my imaginary devil friend, so see ya, like... yeah, so that was a bunch of thoughts kind of bundled together that I had. So
you have highlighted what I find the most disturbing part of all, which is that Yvonne hears, laughs, and walks away. And I find that almost to be shocking behavior from someone who has been so troubled and angry at God and all of humanity when he tells these kinds of stories in the Rebellion chapter. And now it's just funny. Like, I don't understand that reaction. To me, that seems, I thought he understood the suffering of children as the one thing that, kind of you don't laugh at, or that troubles him most about the whole order of things. Has he just given up on that completely? Or is it just like, this girl is toying with my ideas and that's cute. And she's getting it all wrong, and I'm out of here. It's not my problem,
Well, I mean, we don't see this conversation from Yvonne's point of view. Like, he laughed and only stayed 5 minutes and left could mean a whole host of things. I mean, it could, on on the more disturbing side, mean, oh yeah, her turmoil and her discussion of this is just cute, whatever. Or, I mean, have you ever hit a point in your life where something that disturbs you on so deep a level then comes back and stares you on the face and you're just like, I I can't deal with this today. And sometimes you just laugh because something is absurd and horrifying, and you just, like, I can't even.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think the other, like, extra layer, and I have just a hard time understanding all the motivations here, but Alyosha gives his reading and assessment of the whole thing and says he treated you honorably. He's not laughing at you. Like, how he draws that conclusion, I don't know. And what he means by he treated you honorably, I also don't know. And maybe he believes in the compote too, whatever that means.
Right. Well, part of it seems to do with these people, again, wrestling. Like, I felt like with this question of, are we all fundamentally bad or evil? Like, I felt the other really good point Micah made was like that we have this tendency to think of this banality as something horrible out there that we would never do. And Lisa's like, whoa, it freaked me out. And then the next day I thought maybe I could sit there, eat, like she's recognizing this horror in herself. And I feel like that's part of what Yvonne is wrestling with. Maybe he believes in the pineapple compote. Like, maybe we're all just evil and bad deep down. Because she says it's good to be despised, right? That's what she takes away from her conversation with Yvonne. Like, it would be good to be such an evil person that everyone would despise you. And it's like, whoa.
Well, from, autocratic regimes to the Stanford prisoner experiment, like, it's been shown repeatedly that almost everyone is capable of horrendous activity. So, I mean, there's some pineapple compote in all of us, probably.
Yeah, I'm glad that you guys brought out that side of it. And it also just struck me that perhaps the way that Lise is now thinking about herself as an evil, terrible person has some parallel in how Dmitri continuously thinks about himself, like as an insect of the basest desires that really can't control. And I mean, he's not talking about torture, but I mean, he seems to have no control over whether he's going to kill somebody or not. It's just sort of happens that he does or doesn't in a fit of passion, So the creepiest thing of all to me is the ending of this chapter. When, Lise just suddenly slams her finger in the door and then sits down and starts looking at it and then says, what does this mean? Mean. I just did not see that coming. It's just highly disturbing. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts, or is this just like, this girl is really messed up and terrifying?
Is the world mean? Is she mean? Is everything mean? I stared at those 4 words repeatedly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have no idea who or what she's referring to when she says mean. And I also was very disturbed by her slamming her finger in the door. But tying into our conversations about her conflict between her morality and humanity and philosophy and all that other, possibly seeing herself as a terrible person, I really liked what Melissa pointed out before about her almost experimenting with having agency and not just being a victim. That really spoke to me. And I mean, one reading of the slamming the finger in the door is, I'm a terrible person. I deserve punishment. I have agency to punish myself.
Well, and, I find it disturbing. I don't want to say I don't, but I've spent a lot of time working with teenagers. And as a result, you inevitably deal with people who are cutting at some point, and understanding that a lot of it is about having tons of conflict, pain, suffering inside that you don't know what to do with. And that's where I saw this as some expression of that too, right? Like she spends this whole night shaking. She starts saying these horrifying over the top things. It's like she almost wants someone to come and have a real conversation with her about this. And no one yet really has, about evil and suffering. And she, like, the only way sometimes is to literalize your feelings on your own body, right? Like, it's a relief compared to the mental anguish. And that's where it felt to me like it was interesting reading this chapter when the other translation called it lacerations rather than strains before, because it's like this is a literal version of that, right? Like throughout this book we see people who are torturing themselves because they have all this inner turmoil, and she's one of the first. Like Dimitri takes it out on other people, she takes it out on herself, which is also a very gendered way that these things often play out. Women who have no social avenue for violence commit violence against their own bodies often. Yeah, so again, my pop psychology from my years of, but that to me was just such a, and that's where I felt like partly because she's also going through these cycles where she keeps being like, Alyosha, you're the only one I don't have to be ashamed of, but then she suddenly seems ashamed, but then she's not ashamed, and she also keeps being like, sorry, I'm not going to marry you. Take this letter to Yvonne. Like she's like going through all these emotions of shame again. So we're back to the same things I feel like we saw with Fyodor, right? Like if she just wasn't so ashamed of herself. So that's where like I don't know what the means, but I feel like one way really is she's yelling at herself. Like, why would she torture Alyosha like this?
Anyway, I didn't think of Alyosha.
I'm sorry, Aaron, I didn't hear what you said.
Go, Micah, go.
Oh, okay. Well, I think everybody's right on the money when they talk about, how you can use ridicule and how you can use like imagining yourself as the perpetrator rather than the victim as a means of taking hold of the trauma. Because like for those of us, who are the sons or daughters of clerics, I think we can understand that there's almost an inevitable phase for us where we engage in blasphemy as a means of like self-empowerment. And I mean, I know that's not everybody who's the child of a cleric, but it seems like it's the experience for most of us. And I think the reason for that is that when we find that something is oppressing us, however we're feeling it's oppressing us one way or another, ridicule and vulgarity and things like that, they're the ways of taking power. And so one of the things I want to remark about in this situation is I really think what's going on in Lies is it's not so much a new theme as is much a much more subtle and much more human take on the universal theme of the book, which is when confronted with tragedy, are we going to opt for vulnerability, love, self-sacrifice, openness, or some kind of move toward power and control? And this doesn't so much seem like power and control, does it? Because it's in some ways it seems like she's so out of control. But at the same, and it's funny, and the reason why it's funny in a certain way, not funny, haha, but it's funny in the sense that every single time anyone tries to take real control over the situation when they can't, the result is rather pathetic and absurd and so destructive. But I think I think it comes back to exactly that. I don't think it's pop psychology. I mean, it's easy for people to describe it that way, but I don't think that gives the inside enough credit. Because I think that oftentimes pop psychology is just trying to convey something that we know to be universal, which is to be like Joseph Campbell here. Like the question comes like, once we realize we're falling, are we going to embrace the fall, and accept that we're falling and participate, or are we just going to, rebel and close our eyes the whole way down? And I don't know. I feel like what's unfortunate is like, in certain ways, it's really obvious when people are opting for power, right? But then in this poor girl, right, that decision for power, because there's so little agency in the first place, it just becomes, so turned inward. And again, right, like I think with Yvonne, right, like, why would you prefer? She didn't like Yvonne before because when she was feeling helpless, right, Yvonne was the powerful one, and she had no sense of agency, and it was easier to be comfortable with Alyosha because there were no power games. She didn't feel subservient. But now that she wants to be sophisticated and powerful, she can't really be with Alyosha anymore because Alyosha doesn't play the power game. So now the only place where she really knows to go with is Yvonne, who is so self-empowered in his self-containment. I think this is really all about power.
I think there is something funny, haha, in the pursuit of power in the absurd, in the face of a violent existence where you have no significance more than sand or a molecule of water. I was thinking of this when I was reading about her and reflecting on it last night. My own my own sometimes shame, like if I'm talking to my grandmother or something about what I watch or what I listen to, Family Guy, South Park, things that embrace the absurd and are violent about it, all the way to where she's talking about the dead baby. I was thinking about dead baby jokes when I read this. Like the reason for those things to exist, I mean, they're abhorrent to a lot of people, but they exist. Why? I mean, it's when you have no power, you do find a way to deal with it. She's fantasizing about a way to contend with that.
I also thought it was interesting that everything you brought up, Micah, about how she's like she can't be with Alyosha now. Like she really seems in parts of this to be like modeling herself after Katerina, right? Like I'm going to now have a romance like Katerina. I want a husband. What does she say early on to Alyosha? The first thing she says is she's like, I want a husband to torment me. I want someone to marry me and then torment me, right? She's got this weird romance idea mixed up with it too. Like, I don't know. It seems like, another version of her trying to act out this new version of herself. Oh, and just to clarify, I kept saying pop psychology because I have no actual training in psychology, and half of my insights were coming from, watching crime procedurals and hearing about how people dealt with trauma. So, but yeah, I noticed that weird parallel where she's trying to act out not just Yvonne's ideas, but Katerina's idea of love. Like the only way she can imagine love is this sort of tortured, miserable, suffering weirdness, which has been going, if you think has been going on in her house, right? Like Katerina and Yvonne and Dimitri's and Grushenka's insane love affair has been running in and out of her house the whole time.
I also just want to point out real quickly that it is interesting that she somehow has also heard the story about Kolya on the train tracks, and is lucky boy, he gets to do that stuff. I get stuck at home with Madame Koklikov. That's why she's crazy. And I guess my last thought on this chapter is, once again, I think that Dostoevsky has got to be the first author to really capture the scary, irrational side of human nature in a fully realized, modern, scary way. I'm not sure if I'm totally historically right about that, but the level of how believable and scary this is, just that kind of creepy psychology, and how much time he devotes to the irrational side of human nature seems like a sort of landmark in literature. So thank you for that discussion of that chapter. I've always been, I get stuck on that chapter and don't know what to make of it. So it's interesting to hear other people kind of work through some helpful ideas. Chapter 4, Him and a Secret. We've got a Dimitri chapter. I'm again struck by the parallels to his very first confession of an ardent heart in verse and in anecdotes and all that, which, by the way, you'll remember we had a small debate about whether he was drunk at the time or not. And I now submit this chapter as evidence that he always sounds like that, because he's probably not drunk in prison. But this is a pretty interesting chapter. He's all over the place. He's clearly really agitated. We learned Rakitin has been visiting him. Why does Rakitin keep popping up in this book everywhere? What is that guy up to? I think this is the chapter for those of us who have submitted that Dimitri is also wrestling with intellectual ideas and conflicts. This is really, Exhibit A, where he's really trying to work out these ideas in a conscious way. So I don't know what question to ask to get this chapter discussion going. There's my prelude.
Rakitin talks about himself in the third person, so I hate him.
I also like the running thing of Rakitin keep like people making jokes at Rakitin's expense, and then he just yells at them about serfs and goes away. His one go-to thing.
Yeah.
I will say, like, this isn't the main point of this chapter, but hearing the whole poem that Rakitin wrote about Madame Koklakov's foot and the fact that he really was trying to woo her because he had a bet with Dmitri, I don't know, that was all pretty dang funny.
Yeah. They love the first two lines. Ah, what a charming little foot, but what a swelling has come to it.
Yeah, I like her, but she's got money, wink. Is this the first cougar we have in literature?
That's an awesome question, Aaron. Somehow I feel like Shakespeare might have covered that one, but I don't know enough to say.
I don't know him well enough.
Yeah. All right. While we're just on the little side note of this poem, did you all notice that he brags about it having a civic theme? Like he somehow worked like one of his socialist ideas into it. Can you spot that in the poem? Because I'm having a real hard time figuring out what that is. Or is this some sort of, is it in his own way some kind of satirical, making the point that, you know, women are not being educated in this society, and so they end up playing this sort of, oh, I'm ignorant, you know, like the ideas can't fit in their head and all that kind of stuff. I was not sure if this was some sort of women's question. What's the civic theme in the poem, sweetie?
The last two lines about socialized healthcare and education. I don't know.
I'll have to look at it again.
Because he brags about having a civic theme.
I'll have to look at it again. I had a thought earlier, but it's...
Yeah, well, if anyone figures out what the civic theme is, I'd like to know. Because it's like, even Dmitri seems to understand. He's like, oh, and he really did stick in his civic idea. And I'm like, well,
maybe if we knew Pushkin better? I don't know.
Yeah, Rakitin is easy to hate, especially when you find out this whole scheme, like he's trying to woo her for 150,000 rubles so he can move someplace and open a newspaper, and like, what a scoundrel.
Well, he can use the capital better than she can, so, you know.
Oh, yeah, and he has this whole, like, that was where Dmitri was kind of funny, like, it has a civic purpose or whatever. You know, he'll use it for good, like, and Dmitri makes some comment about like they all have like the you know, Commonwealth justification for them just being kind of greedy, grabbing jerks. I love when Rakitin makes this comment, like he does not want to acknowledge that he's passing Alyosha, and so he's like fumbles with his coat and looks around for his umbrella and is like, can't forget my things. And Dimitri's like, or anyone else's.
There's while it's quiet, as an economist, I enjoy the exchange where Rakitin is basically saying it's better to worry about beef prices than God. You know, definitely communist kind of a theme. And Mitya is like, well, without God, you just raise beef prices for your own benefit, jackass. Right, that's the problem with the communist system. One person can't decide for anyone else very well. And the criticism is there before they tried it, so it's almost like someone thought it was a bad idea.
I was reminded of that great line from The Crucible. I can't remember the name of the character, but when the council's coming together and the people, there are some people who just want nothing to do with all this witch trial nonsense. and one guy says, "I don't have an opinion. I'm a businessman."
Well, let's talk a little bit about the ideas that Dimitri is wrestling with here. So on the one hand, he seems to have been sincerely troubled by, like, Yvonne's coming and visiting him and is apparently like indoctrinating him with his own ideas, no God and all this stuff, and science, and maybe this is Rakitin as well. And this actually seems to be really like tormenting Dimitri. He's heard about nerves in the brain, and now he's all, really, this seems to have caused a sort of crisis of faith for him. At the same time, he has his hymn, this new idea of how he'll be the reformed man and life is worth living. And once again, this is where I hear echoes of the Confessions of an Ardent Heart chapters. Like, he's practically singing Ode to Joy. It's like, even if I got to go, swing a sledgehammer in a mine, like, there's other human hearts there, and I'll sing joy to God, even just knowing that the sun's up there somewhere. You guys have comments about Dimitri's thought process and ideas he's wrestling with here?
I mean, one thing that jumps out, like, he brings up the new man a couple times, and I think Yvonne mentions the new man in the Devil chapter as well. And it goes back to one of the sort of recurring things with a lot of characters, which is that they're all convinced that, like, come tomorrow, I'm going to be a new person and I'm going to do everything right and everything's going to go fine from now on, which was, a big thing for Dimitri, throughout his sort of crisis of chapter 8 or whatever. And I want to take Dimitri seriously, that, I'm going to go and I'm going to suffer and I'm going to find joy in suffering because I will know that God is out there somewhere. But it's still like, that's what I'm going to do tomorrow. I don't know how seriously to take him, even now.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one of those cases where, like we were talking about earlier, people don't just change like a snap and suddenly a different person. Even if you have a quote unquote change of heart or a, dream that gives you an epiphany or whatever, you still have to work at habits to actually, change your behaviors. But it's still worthwhile to struggle with all those big ideas. And one that really struck me in this chapter, you mentioned a few minutes ago, was the God and science, on 588 and 489, where he says he feels sorry for God because he just learned that, all these nerves that are trembling are actually causing behavior and chemistry and not God. And it's a fascinating way to look at it. Part of me is looking at and saying, oh, like historical, like these kind of science ideas were pretty new, I think, at the time. But then I look at it and I'm like, except that the arguments between religion and science are like super relevant today. Like, this is not an issue that's been resolved in the past 150 years. And that's fascinating to me.
And it's going to pop back again when Yvonne and the Devil are talking. It's this question of, does, like, science have any bearing on, on religious matters? Like, this is kind of I think the philosophical, or one of the shorthands is like the God of the gaps. It's like the God who represents everything that science doesn't know yet. And so that means automatically, as science expands, then, the room for God contracts. And Dimitri's kind of struggling with that. I think that's very different from how Dostoevsky wants to interpret it. And, even his Devil's like, it doesn't really, all of this science crap doesn't really have that much to do with us. We think it's kind of wacky. But it's certainly breaking Dimitri's heart.
I also to me, I see really interesting parallels between Dmitri and Zosima's brother. Because I mean, I have to, I keep remembering he's in prison, right? He's been in prison for months now. I feel like that's certain. Like, on the one hand, we have this character Lise we've just talked about, who goes from having no hope, no future, no choices, to suddenly having all this agency. And then you have like Father Zosima's brother and Dmitri, which is the opposite, right? Like, he's wrestling with all these ideas, but like, what happens when you literally run out of choices, right? Like, it's not, I mean, he might have a choice. We learned by the end of the chapter he might have the choice to run away. But to some extent, like, for months, it's sitting there thinking, like, how am I going to find a way to make meaning, to make sense of a situation that I'm totally stuck in, right? Like, dying or being sent off to prison. I just feel like that's part of, like, I'm actually really moved when he starts talking about the new man that he's found within him on 591. And he's talking about how he can go and find a way to have meaning in the midst of his suffering. And I see that being posed directly as a response to Ivan, right? Because then he goes right into that question, why is the wee one poor? So, like, it's this move that I think the book makes over and over again, is there's no answer to the why. Why does your brother die of a horrible disease? Why are children slaughtered? There's no answer to the why. There's just this choice. Are you going to find a way to love others around you and make meaning out of it? Or are you going to give in to despair or anger or violence or something? I mean, I think I'm really touched by it because those are ideas I'm trying to live into. And like Dmitri, I'm torn in half all the time. Like, I'm not sure how doable they are. I find it hard to believe in them. And I feel like that's what we see him over and over again. He like wants to do this, but also knows that it's going to be huge, right? Like, going to hard labor in Siberia for 20 years, it's not like every day you're just going to wake up and like that's going to be, I don't know. So I feel like there is something very noble, but he's also keeps acknowledging, you know, if it could be taken away from him, that would be great. Even Jesus prayed that prayer, right? Like, there's some way that you have to acknowledge you don't want this terrible suffering. Sorry.
I'm going to jump in there. So I'm glad you said that. I pretty much share the same perspective on this section. And I think what I want to point out is the interesting adoption by Dmitri of the guilty for all and for everyone else language that we've heard from Zosima's brother and Zosima. And here it's popping up at Dmitri, and you wonder, where did he get that from? Is this somehow the nature of all spiritual kind of conversions for Dostoevsky? Like, this is the essence of what conversion looks like, is this recognition that I am deeply connected and somehow responsible for everyone else and what's going wrong with them. But I just think I don't know what to make of that necessarily, but his wee one dream seems to have inspired this and planted this idea in him that he is responsible for these children somehow. So now he is somehow willing to endure an unjust suffering because he knows that he is also a cause of unjust suffering somehow. And within that context, he's going to try to be a source of hope and comfort to others, kind of encouraging the rest of the chain gang, I guess. But it's definitely, that language really leaps off the page. Like, we have seen this before in significant passages. I want to point out a couple just quotes from Dmitri that I thought were fairly profound or worth noting in this chapter. So in 588, he makes an interesting proclamation. The Karamazovs are not scoundrels, but philosophers, because all real Russians are philosophers. And then even more interesting passage, 592, last paragraph. You see, before I didn't have any of these doubts, but they were all hiding in me. Maybe I was drinking and fighting and raging just because unknown ideas were storming inside me. I was fighting to quell them within me, to tame them, to subdue them. Interesting. He's certainly doing a lot of thinking now, and it's like, are these kind of questions that Dostoevsky seems to suggest, like every young Russian man has to settle these questions. That's like part of, the age or whatever. This is where we see Dmitri is not without the intellectual side. And I guess making him hold still in prison is what it takes for him to actually start to work some of those ideas out.
Right. And I think it's not just that you have to, confront these ideas, but it's that you have to be tormented by them, or they have to, because the follow-up to, Karamazov's are not scoundrels but philosophers, all real Russians are philosophers, and you, even though you've studied, are not a philosopher. And the upshot, I think, is that Rakitin's not bothered by any of this. He has, and maybe that's part of what Michael was getting at with that capriciousness that seems to have, Rakitin and Smerdikov, I think, are the two who come to me as like really cold-blooded about, like, the people who can genuinely embrace the fact that the world is just kind of absurd and crappy, and like they're fine with it. Smerdikov is like, let's have some lemonade. Rakitin isn't bothered. But Dmitri and, certainly Ivan and Lisa also, or Liza, are tormented and unable to settle the question. And if there is nothing meaningful in the world, then that's also unacceptable. While Micah was talking, I was going back and remembering that Father Zosima said something, basically said that almost exactly to Ivan. It was that, even though you don't believe, you should consider it a gift that you are tormented by the questions of belief. You should thank God that you were given with a soul that can be tormented by these torments, I think, something like that. And I think that is the Russian philosopher-ness of it. It is good to be tormented. Very, very Dostoevsky.
Jason, you cut out there. I'm not sure if you're still trying to say anything.
Sorry about that. Russians think that it's good to be tormented.
Right. I want to highlight another I think this is one of the most insightful passages into Ivan's character that suddenly gets revealed here. So Dmitri is talking with Rakitin, and Rakitin's giving him all this, he's definitely sharing his philosophy, but then Dmitri's saying Ivan keeps his ideas to himself mostly, and I want to drink from his source. I'm trying to figure out, well, what do you really think? And so he's like, there's one time he did say something. This is 593. What did he say? Alyosha picked up hastily. I said to him, then everything is permitted in that case? He frowned. Fyodor Pavlovitch, our papa, was a little pig, he said, but his thinking was right. That's what he came back with. That's all he ever said. It's even neater than Rakitin. So it's interesting to hear from Ivan, who we know despised his father, that still he basically thinks, okay, he may have been a pig, but, his thinking is essentially, correct in light of the meaninglessness of this world or whatever. Everything's permitted. And I think the devil later will say to him, I forget it was the devil or if it was someone else, but you are the most like your father out of all the brothers.
think Smerdikov says that to him, and he might say something about the pigness too, someone might say something about being a pig like his father, or maybe about his father being a pig. I had trouble with the chronology of this chapter, trying to figure out who talked to who in what order, especially in like. And so I think that someone might have said something about him being like his father, and about his father being a pig to Ivan prior to this conversation with Dmitri. Tidbits.
Other themes or passages that people want to talk about before we move on from this chapter?
I had mentioned social stuff, less character stuff. I had mentioned the prices, but there was also Dimitri saying, if God is driven from the earth, we'll meet him underground. I felt that was another social commentary maybe against some of these movements. That when you were reading quotes from the chapter, that's one I'd like to add.
I just want to say I really wish Taggy was here for this chapter. I feel like he would have something either really interesting or really weird or both to say. So I'm putting that out there because maybe he'll watch this and then have things to say later.
We miss you, Taggy. Get well soon.
I think the only other thing I noted specifically in this chapter was at the top of 593, between where they're talking about the price of beef and then when they're talking about Ivan's ideas, which we've already discussed. He has a moment where he says, "What is virtue? Answer me that, Alexei. I have one virtue and a Chinese has another, so it's a relative thing. Or not? Not relative? Insidious question. You mustn't laugh if I tell you I didn't sleep for 2 nights because of it. I just keep wondering now how people can live and think nothing about these things." And that struck me especially this week because just a few days ago, my sister and I were having discussion about morality, and I kept using the word morality, and every time I used it, I'm like, I hate that word because it can mean so many different things, and it doesn't quite mean what I want it to mean in this context. And so we were kind of talking about the differences between morality.
And this is a side that most people aren't aware about Madame Koklikov, but she stays up at night worrying about the price of beef.
McGee, you were breaking up. I didn't hear most of that.
Yeah, I think we both, that goes both ways, actually. I thought you were done talking, but you were still going. It was just not coming through. So sorry about that. I was just saying, hearing Dmitri say that he gets no sleep over this for 2 nights, I actually believe him there. But it reminds me of Madame Koklikov saying, and this is a side of me that most people aren't aware of, but, I stay up worrying about the value of the ruble or whatever. I have to just note, we can't leave it without any comment that Dmitri says, let me give you a piece of advice, Alyosha. Never ask a woman forgiveness.
I can vouch for that.
Y'all getting your relationship advice from Dmitri? I'm just saying.
Yeah, right. He's like, I think he ends that with some weird statement about himself. Remember that rule. It was taught to you by your brother Mitya, who perished because of women.
Also, Rakitin's a Freemason, and Freemasons run the country, so conspiracy.
And do we need to make any comment about the escape plan?
There is one.
All right, let's move on. We finally get Katya back after hundreds of pages where she's just referred to by name. And a pretty interesting scene with her when Ivan is leaving and Alexei shows up. You guys have she seems to be a little bit menacing, I think is the word that even gets used in the text maybe about her. She's trying to decide how she's going to testify and whose side is she on, and will she defend or kind of incriminate Dmitri? No takers on Katya commentary? I'll note that it's odd, as Yvonne points out later, that she suddenly says, Yvonne, it was you who convinced me that Dmitri was the murderer. And in fact, it was completely the reverse. So I don't know what to make of that completely. I suppose the most significant thing in this chapter is probably the exchange between Yvonne and Alyosha, where, first of all, we have some interaction about Lise, which maybe we can talk about in a second, but I'm going to jump straight to the real meat of it, which is Yvonne, or Alyosha, suddenly sort of prophesying here in a very Elder Zosima clairvoyant moment, that, you know, I know only one thing, it was not you who killed father. And Yvonne is just completely dumbstruck by this. Initially, like, what could you be talking about? But then he knows. And he's like, how can you possibly know this? That this is what I was thinking. Were you there? You saw him too. And like, and you know, it's like, how did Alyosha get this information? He seems to be actually receiving this as some kind of compulsory revelation that he's delivering very much as a prophet. You've said it to yourself many times while you were alone during these 2 horrible months. Alyosha continued as softly and distinctly as before, but he was now speaking not of himself, as it were, not of his own will, but of obeying some sort of irresistible command. You've accused yourself and confessed to yourself that you and you alone are the murderer, but it was not you who killed him. You are mistaken. The murder was not you. Do you hear? It was not you. God has sent me to tell you that. And he insists on this point so strongly that it ends up actually fracturing. This is the thing that fractures the relationship, and Yvonne has to drive him away because he doesn't want to confront it. He doesn't even want to like raise the question, and says, you know, I can't bear prophets and epileptics, messengers from God especially. And from this moment on, I'm breaking with you, and I suppose forever. I think this is the first time we really get the sense that Yvonne is struggling with a sense of guilt intensely about this. And he's been in a sort of denial and hiding it from himself. And I think Alyosha bringing this up directly, Alyosha becomes such a symbol and reminder of this sense of guilt that he has to push him away completely.
And that's, you know, that's recurred multiple times on the sort of Alyosha prophecy that I also took his statement to Dmitri as sort of unequivocal. No, it absolutely wasn't you, to be a sort of similar, like he feels like he's not in control of himself, or it's this outburst that pops out as if by magic, or this certainty that pops out as if by magic. And yeah, this was part of what I was talking about in terms of like I was having so much trouble following the chronology of like who talked to who when. So what I realized was 2 months ago, Alyosha said that Alyosha told Ivan that he had believed that Ivan wanted Dmitri to kill Fyodor. I did think that was what was in your heart. And that was what caused the break between them initially. And then 2 months later, they run into each other again here. And Alyosha says the thing about, it's sort of like, despite what I said before, you didn't kill him. And that causes like the final break. So, you know, twice now, Ivan has sort of rejected Alyosha's judgment, non-judgment, just his sort of Alyosha-ness. Alyoshan insight.
Well, and this isn't like a deep spiritual insight, but I think like one of the things I find so fascinating about this book is, and this part starts to feel to me psychologically like what we would modernly call like a mystery or crime, right? Like we're also seeing the psychological aspect of all the characters trying to figure out who's guilty with the extra Dostoevsky aspect that I feel like we're seeing so much of the psychology. Like you were saying earlier, like, well, Katya says Ivan convinced her that Dmitri was the killer, and Ivan thinks that Katya convinced him. It's like we're seeing all of these characters working through why they think what they think about this murder, which I find pretty interesting.
I think another notable detail here is the level of disdain that you hear in Ivan's voice when he's talking about Dmitri. He calls him the monster, you know, the murderer. He's completely dehumanized him in a way, which makes it a little surprising to me that he's trying to help him with this escape. And you know, continuing on the psychological themes that Melissa was mentioning, it seems like a lot of the, I guess this comes up in later chapters, but a lot of the motivation for Ivan aiding Dmitri in escaping seems to be motivated by guilt. The sense that, like, I was indirectly responsible for this murder, even if Dmitri is the one that did it, like, several things. I don't want it to look like I was motivated just by selfish desire for the inheritance, like Smerdikov speculates. So I'm going to use some of that money to help him escape. But then I think part of this sense of guilt, like I'm also responsible for this murder, so I'm going to have to help anyone else out that was involved, you know, because it's really my fault. So I had to think for a while. It's like very complex what Ivan is going through in these chapters and trying to figure out all his motivations. At first I found them hard to understand, but as I thought about it more, I was like, okay, so I think that sense of guilt and denial is driving him through most of these chapters. Maybe we can comment briefly on page 602 where Alyosha and Ivan have their conversation about Lise. Is that 602? I'm sorry, that's the wrong page. 600. Again, another really disturbing revelation here as Alyosha hands over the letter. Ivan says, she's not yet 16, I believe, and already offering herself. You know, the way loose women offer themselves. And Alyosha goes pleading for her. She's a child. You're offending a child. She's very ill. You know, I wanted, on the contrary, to hear something from you to save her. And his response is so cold. You'll hear nothing from me. If she's a child, I'm not her nanny. Keep still, Lexi. Don't go on. I'm not even thinking about it. This is where I feel like like that Fyodor side is kind of coming out. Like he is somewhat embracing this, you know, to hell with everyone else. I'm doing whatever I want, and my brother's keeper. Like, I don't really think we've seen that. So obviously in him before, but now he's just kind of starting to be like a jerk to people.
I think he did literally say he wasn't Dmitri's keeper at some point while he was trying to decide whether to go to Tremashnia.
Right.
But yeah, he's embracing the dark.
Well, and that's where it seems to me sort of like a direct opposite to the whole ripple effect we've been talking about, right? Like we've already said he's had one. He's affecting Lise. He's affecting Smerdyakov. These people are having these ideas because of him, but he doesn't want to take any part of that responsibility. But at the same time, he does, right? Like the rest of this chapter is basically him unraveling with guilt because he does know that in some way, and it's a real long mess figuring out in exactly what way, but in some way, something he did affected what Smerdyakov did that day. There was some interconnection. He had some effect on him, but he has to deny that, right? He if it almost seems like if he admits he can affect other people, he's going to have to face that fact, and he just can't. So he has to be cold. He has to push her away. He has to push Alyosha away. He's no longer capable of loving Katerina. Like, it's just, he's having to push everyone away because otherwise you have to admit the fact that your ideas might affect other people.
Yeah, it's like he's the film negative of Zosima's idea, guilty for all and before all. Like he's having to work that out backwards through his own experience. Like he's slowly coming to the realization that he actually is responsible for someone else, you know, and that his ideas have had a devastating effect.
And it's almost like he's doing some weird reverse math of like Lisa's going through this thing where she's realizing, oh, there's this horrible evil. Maybe I'm capable of that. And it's almost like Ivan is so angry at Dmitri because if Dmitri is a vicious, horrible, terrible murderer, then Ivan is not, right? Like it's this opposite idea of instead of recognizing we all have this darkness, it's like if we could just find the right person to blame, then I don't have to feel bad. And that's such a human impulse, right? How many of us do that all the time? That's like the same thing we were talking about earlier. It's easier to think that society is corrupt and genocidal and that person is an evil murderer, but I just have my philosophical ideas. I couldn't be any part of this mess.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to suggest that we move on to the Smerdyakov chapters and that we treat those as one topic. The first, second, and third meetings with Smerdyakov, like open rein to go through those, any points you want to talk about in these kind of excruciating conversations, you know.
I have to say, I enjoyed the. Oh, go, Micah.
Well, I just, because I'm going to feel the need to say this like 50 times throughout discussing this, I'm just going to say it once so I don't have to say it a bunch of times because I'm going to be bursting to say it. I literally wrote like in the margins a number of times, I want to punch you in the face. I want to punch you in the face. Like there's just something about Smerdyakov. I always want to punch him in the face. And I understand that like we're trying to get a really nuanced like position of this brilliant character, but at the same time, like, ugh, I hate him and I want to punch him in the face. Sorry, I know that's immature, but if I don't say it now, I'm going to say it like 50 times through the conversation.
Well, and Ivan literally does punch him, you know.
I know, but like that's part of the frustration because it's not me. Like I wanted to like feel my own fist, and like when he doesn't do it more, I get frustrated. Like I don't know.
That's the thing that is really irritating and maddening. It drives Ivan insane. It drives all of us insane. Is this whole there's this whole demeanor to Smerdyakov where he's like, we are the intelligent people, and we have this unspoken alliance where we can kind of wink and nod, and we all know that, you know, we're above the rules and don't have to play along, and like you're in on this with me, you know, like stop trying to pretend like you're not, you know. And I think that sort of like Dostoevsky describes his left eye as sort of always, you know, squinting or whatever. It's just infuriating that he never gets to his point openly and directly, and he's somehow kind of maintaining a plausible deniability argument at first, but also kind of like, is this a joke? Like, you know, you're in on this, and making this kind of ominous threat the first time, you know, this kind of veiled threat, like, it's go ahead and don't tell the commissioner about our conversation, and I also won't tell him the things you said, you know. And Yvonne doesn't even realize that that was, you know, kind of a jab until a couple minutes later.
I mean, I will say, as annoying as I found Smerdyakov, and especially reading through all of his like rambling, I also was kind of like, dude, you're a freaking criminal genius in a way. Like, he really is an like, right? He has an excuse for everything, and he can spin everything. He would have been a great lawyer, like better than the lawyer we're going to see coming up. Like, every single thing Yvonne brings up, he's like, oh, well, you could explain it this way. And sometimes he's saying the exact opposite thing of a minute he said before. Yeah, that's all. I just was impressed by how Smerdyakov seems to like. And I also think it has a point, right? It's showing the dangers of just pure rationalization, divorced from any sort of ethics or morality, right? Like, you can rationalize anything, and it's showing us the kind of hollowness of pure rhetoric. But it's also kind of impressive.
And I do find him frustrating in some ways, but as a fellow epileptic, in that sense, I find him sympathetic. And I would say that there's some talk of epilepsy in general, and that they call it a presentiment, called an aura. That's mainly what I deal with, and it is like, you can tell that things are coming. So it's not just, you know, necessarily epilepsy isn't just a stochastic shock that just happens sometimes. It is something that you can foretell, and you can foretell a lot. At least I can. And sounds like he can as well foretell a lot of other things as well.
Let me pose a general question with that, you know, that's not digging into the specifics so much, but do you guys buy Smerdyakov's argument that he basically cued Yvonne in on this whole plan with his little Chermashnaya question, and that Yvonne essentially gave his consent?
Yes and no. I mean, I feel like he was super confusing, but I do think Smerdyakov thinks that there is, like, I think when we see those first few conversations, he really does think Yvonne is like in on it with him. And not to like total, like, I don't think Yvonne totally got, you know, oh, Smerdyakov has this whole plan to kill him, blah, blah, blah. Like, Smerdyakov seems to think Yvonne knew every step. But if we remember back, Yvonne knew something weird was going on. And that was when he first said, I'm not my brother's keeper. At one point, he's just kind of like, F it, I'm going to Moscow. Like, the heck with all you suckers, right? Like, I don't think he knew, like, Smerdyakov is like, oh, when I winked and like twitched this one way and then named this town, it meant these things. And I'm sure Yvonne had no idea about that. And is like legitimately like, dude, what the F are you talking about? But on the other hand, I do think we saw Yvonne like have a bad feeling, know that if he left, something bad was going down, and deliberately make the choice to just step out of it. So that's why I'm saying yes and no. Is like, I think Smerdyakov really thought they had an agreement. We're intelligent men, like, we got this, and it's kind of crazy and diluted. But everything in the first few chapters makes me think he does think Yvonne is in on it, and he's just as mystified when Yvonne keeps coming back and asking him like more questions. That's my read.
I really do enjoy his mystification, mostly because, like, after a number of chapters of Yvonne behaving like a dick, it's nice to see him sort of repeatedly called kind of stupid, like, over and over again. That must just be infuriating for him. Like, you really don't understand this? You know, I don't.
And I think that he does. So my read is that this is obviously he didn't know the whole plan, but the fact that on that train he called himself a scoundrel back in that ominous chapter, and this kind of mysterious conversation exchange originally happened. You know, and then the thing that really seems to weigh on him is this time he crept out of bed or whatever and listened to what his father is. It's like he's imagining the murder taking place, and I think that's why it's so loathsome. It's like listening, like, is something bad going to happen? Like, it's like he's already. I don't think he's really worked out a plan or had this all cross his mind in a conscious way, but I think in a subconscious or unconscious way, he's kind of aware, like, there's a definite probability that someone could come and kill my father, and I'm pretty okay with that idea. And he's already said it, you know, like Viper will eat Viper.
Given how much guilt he has, I mean, the best you can say for him is he just wanted to maintain some like plausible deniability. I mean, he feels incredibly guilty, and he was, you know, without saying so, was tacitly consenting to murder. I thought.
I think there's a difference though between like him having this general feeling or on some conscious or subconscious level being okay with his father's murder. I think there's a difference between that and implicitly giving his consent to Smerdyakov to do it. I don't see that consent having happened in the way that Smerdyakov thinks it did.
Yeah, first degree and second degree, and those where the law has the thing.
Well, but I don't think, to me personally, I don't think Ivan would have be first degree second. I don't think he had any desire, or like he kind of wanted his father dead, but I really in that moment felt like he was just like, everything's permissible, Viper will eat Viper, like I'm just so bored with this, I'm you know what I mean? Like I felt like it was the opposite of being responsible on behalf of all and for all. That was to me the first moment when he just said, I just don't want to even be part of this, I'm going to try and wash my hands of it and just leave and let the pieces fall where they may. Like I honestly think he had a bad feeling, but he didn't know that Smerdyakov had a whole plan or that Dmitri. He was just like, I don't even want to be involved, and just like took a step back and was not shocked when things fell out as they did. But I read him as honestly not knowing for a long time whether Smerdyakov or Dmitri did it. Honestly not caring, just not wanting to be involved, but then gradually realizing like whoever did it, he left the space wide open, right? Like, so that to me is where he's not like guilty of murder the way that he seems to think he is, but there is this recognition that your actions affect other people. And like, if you know someone's going to get murdered, maybe you should do something about it. But I mean, that was just my read.
I think what's another really fascinating part, I think the most fascinating is the third meeting, when Smerdyakov just comes clean. And is saying like, look, man, all I did was act out your philosophies that you've been saying. And we all know everything's permitted. So I did it, you know? And I think it's really interesting to see how like for how much Ivan says he doesn't care what happens and let Viper eat Viper, like suddenly he really cares when it actually happened. He is absolutely racked with guilt and, you know, like is doing everything possible to somehow work out a way where he's not responsible in any way for this happening, or how he can fix it somehow, you know, to mitigate some of the effects or whatever. And it's really, really interesting and dramatic when Smerdyakov basically calls him to his face, like, where did all your courage go, you coward? Like, you don't have the courage to live out your ideas, actually. I did, you know? And then the question is, that doesn't seem to be going very well for Smerdyakov either, you know? It doesn't really make clear whether he feels any remorse or repentance. But it seems like this is gnawing at him, and this is maybe the underlying cause of his physical deterioration, is that he has not been able to handle the blood on his hands either, which that would be a very common, I mean, that's Crime and Punishment too. Like, I tried it and this really did not go well for me. And I do think it's really fascinating that there's very rarely like symbolic moments in Dostoevsky, but when he hides the money under the homilies of Saint Isaac the Syrian, who is the one that Zosima is practically quoting when he's talking about loving all the earth and all of creation and all the animals and the reptiles and everything. It's like, you know, that book is on the table is highly symbolic, I think. And I'm not sure if it's like, is he reading it? Is he feeling some remorse? I don't know. But it's really interesting to see this intellectual showdown as Dmitri gets presented with, you know, these are your ideas at work.
It's interesting. I just noticed I had a sticker right on that part you said. You used to be brave once, so you used to say everything is permitted, and I've got so frightened. And then immediately after, Smerdyakov says, would you like some lemonade? I'll tell them to bring some up, which, like, after our whole talk about the pineapple
Maybe some
compote. Yeah, I mean, that actually is. But then immediately after that, he hides the money under the, like, it's literally the next paragraph where he hides the money under Sir Isaac the Syrian. So there's something weird, like Smerdyakov might be disintegrating here too, right? Like maybe feeling guilt, but at the same time, like literally, he's literally acting out in some ways. I mean, not quite as graphically, but he just murdered somebody and he's like, I murdered someone and now it's freaking you out. Well, I mean, would you like a drink? Like, maybe that will help. Like, I don't know. There's something very banal there that's creepy.
I think we also should point out how Smerdyakov now seems to be trying to pin all the guilt on Ivan. He's like, you're the one legally responsible. You're the real murderer. Like, he seems to have been worried the whole time that Ivan was trying to pin all the blame on him. And when he realizes Ivan actually was sort of in the dark about this, he seems a little shocked by that. But then he's definitely making this effort to say, like, you know, you're the mastermind here. I'm just your faithful servant, right? Your faithful Lasharda or whatever he says.
But at the same time, I think that's such a misinterpretation of, you know, on Smerdykov's part, of taking these, you know, few things that Ivan might have said or implied or attitudes he had and interpreting that as instruction to go kill. I think that's a huge misinterpretation.
I'm going to speculate a little bit here about Smerdyakov, because he is, you know, one of the most mysterious characters. What are his motivations? What does he actually like? We learned early on it's really hard. You know, he doesn't seem interested in most things. It seems like his plan was originally, okay, Dimitri's probably going to sneak in. He may kill father. I've hidden the money so I can steal this $3,000 and I'll just benefit from the crime a little bit without carrying it out myself. And it seems like his plan was, I'm getting out of Cowtown, Russia, and I'm off to an enlightened country of France, you know? And he seems like still to be thinking about that plan, like he's learning French vocab in the hospital and stuff. And it seems to me that, this is my speculation here, he's somehow not able to bring himself to go through with that. Like, I think he is having guilt and remorse. Like, he can't live with the blood on his hands, which is leading to his physical breakdown. And he simply seems to be unable to actually carry out the rest of his plan and go ahead and move. And that's why he just hands over the money to Ivan, and seems to have made up his mind that the only option left is to hang himself. So real tragic ending. and you wonder what was going on in his head. We don't really get many glimpses of it. It's just sort of, he makes the revelation to Yvonne, and then he's gone. So there's my speculation about his little character arc. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about what was going on actually in Smerdykov. Why is he now racked with guilt? And it seems like he never cared about anybody, but suddenly he too, can't get over it.
I don't know if there's still an element of parasite here. It was, suggested perhaps to be Fyodor's biological son. So, I mean, there's this just ridiculous level of unbalanced Ivan's, philosophy through this lens of somebody coming from not quite in the house, right? And it's all kind of wild. I kept thinking about this might be his dad too, and he might be wishing the same things in a ridiculous way as well that Ivan and Dmitri were wishing, but it's unspoken.
Can you repeat that last sentence? I had an internet failure.
That he might be wishing the same things that Dmitri and Ivan are, in this culturally unspeakable way or something.
I think in terms of the guilt too, yes, that might have been his father. It might have been parricide, which is seen as worse than, I don't know, regular murder. I don't know what to call it, but also there's a huge difference between philosophizing that, this is what people want, or it doesn't matter, or morality doesn't matter, or anything like that. There's a huge difference between saying or thinking these things and actually killing someone. I mean, even in cases of, in cases of soldiers going off to war, and war is not seen as murder, it's seen as having all these rationalizations and all this whatever, and you have, how many soldiers with PTSD, because no matter the rationalization, you have blood on your hands. Or, you look at Shakespeare, the whole plot of the Scottish play, the blood on the hands that won't come off, and people go crazy and kill themselves. I don't think the guilt is hard to understand, because no matter your philosophy, I think the experience of doing something so horrific gets to people.
Yeah. But if there were someone that could pull it off convincingly, you'd think it'd be Smerdykov, who, despised everyone his whole life and never gave a damn. But even him, this was just way out of the question. He seems to be just getting more and more exhausted, and by this third conversation, seems just angry with Yvonne. This is your fault that I did this, and he, almost resenting him for putting him up to it, And now I've got this useless money while I'm dying, and I don't even want to use it now,
I think one of the really brilliant things about this book, not that there aren't a laundry list of things that are brilliant about this book, is right when you might think that it could put you in some ways on the brink of despair, there are times in this book, lies, this conversation, or the conversation with the Yvonne's conversation with the devil, where you're really low. At the same time, there's something about this that really helps balance it out as an argument for the Alyosha element of the book, because the nature of whether or not people think love and self-sacrifice is meaningless, ultimately, Smerdykov, even in this pure expression of radical nihilistic freedom, it's still self-defeating. That's the ultimate thing, is this thing that Smerdykov is ultimately isn't sustainable, regardless of whether or not you think that there's next existential point to be made in terms of the organic human being. It's simply not sustainable.
I want to highlight two passages. I mistakenly earlier attributed this to the devil, but it actually is Smerdyakov who compares Ivan with Fyodor. This is the bottom of 632. And Smerdyakov is saying why Ivan won't actually tell on him and turn him in and all this stuff. You're too intelligent, sir. You love money. That I know. You also love respect because you're very proud. You love women's charms exceedingly, and most of all, you love living in peaceful prosperity without bowing to anyone. That you love most of all, sir. You won't want to ruin your life forever by taking such shame upon yourself in court. Here we go. You are like Fyodor Pavlovich most of all. It's you of all his children who came out resembling him most, having the same soul as him, sir. And Ivan says, you're not stupid. The other last passage I want to comment on is a little transformation that's taking place here in Ivan. If you remember, on the way in to meet Smerdyakov, he ran into a drunk guy in the middle of this blizzard and just pushed him over in the snow and was like, yeah, he'll freeze, whatever. He and goes on. And then he comes out and the guy's still lying there. And he spends an hour or two like picking it up, getting him to the police station, making sure he's fed. He spends a bunch of money. It's like, I'm the good Samaritan now, even though I was actually the one that beat you and robbed you the first time or whatever. He's starting to feel so much better about himself. He's like, okay, I did a good thing, and I'm going to go tell the authorities and get this all straightened out. I'm going to even confess to my own harm, you know? And it's interesting that he has this thought, like, shouldn't I go to the prosecutor right now? And he decides kind of when he gets home, I'll everything tomorrow. I'll do it all tomorrow. And right at that moment, all the joy and the self-content and all the better feelings he had completely evaporate. So it's like, you know, I think he's a little bit aware that he is once again abdicating the responsible thing to do here, and like, I'll sort this out tomorrow, and you know, in my testimony at the trial, it'll be fine. And somehow he knows that's probably not enough, or he really should bring someone else in on this, especially considering he's just had a confession from the murderer, you know. Jason, you look like you're about to say something. Am I wrong?
Oh no, yeah, it's the same. It's the same thing. It's that tomorrow I'm going to be a good person. Tomorrow, it's the same thing that Dimitri's been saying over and over again. You know, my new life, my new virtuous life begins tomorrow.
We call this unrealistic expectations in economics. It's one of the pillars of irrationality that like pokes holes in our theories of like rational individual choice. Is I will lose the weight tomorrow, right? Everything is tomorrow. And we have really bad like understanding of time preferences and how we're going to act as humans. And that's a really, really, really cool insight to see at this point, historically being written about in literature. Because in my field, we had to go like, oh, this is a thing like 130 years later.
Yeah, Dostoevsky had the irrationality and bad decision-making thing nailed a long time ago. So let's move on to the devil chapter. I've been looking forward to talking about this one with you guys. And I apologize that we've kind of stalled so long.
Before we start that, can I ask a question?
No, sorry, that was for Taggy. Taggy spoke up to me.
So, Melissa, I'm trying to remember because your husband told me to write this down and I didn't, so now I'm dumb.
So Micah, she's not actually in the room right now.
Oh, well.
She's not at her desk.
But earlier in our discussion,
here she is. Hang on, Micah.
something. Okay.
Here she is.
Earlier in our discussions, there was something she brought up that was like so perfect for this discussion about like Ivan conceiving himself as like the visitor. And I was just like, oh, that'll make so much sense for something. And then like Chris like promptly shut me up. But there was something like really good that like you told me I should make a note of to relate to like right now, but I don't remember what it was.
Oh, you're talking about like weeks ago.
Weeks ago.
Yeah.
It had something to do with like Ivan being like the guest and like disciplining himself as like what does it mean to be the guest who like has always managed to like be more than like his keep, and therefore like that's how he's kind of gotten by. And I was thinking, oh, like the devil, right? Like, and I don't know, like there was something you made like some like super insightful comments that your husband told me to write down, and then I didn't, and now I'm feeling stupid.
Well, I remember having that conversation, but I don't remember what I said.
Sorry, we'll do the entire thing over again. Read the whole book over, and then people can comment about any section at any time. This has got to be one of the greatest portrayals of the devil ever. Like, the devil as the kind of gentleman sponger. In a lot of ways, he's actually Maximov-esque. And like the well-meaning devil who, you know, is sort of forced into this cosmic role that he doesn't want to play, and flies around the universe, going to dinner parties in slightly tattered, out of fashion suits. I found this chapter incredibly entertaining and funny. I don't know. It's all different parts of Ivan's psyche. I have no idea where to begin on this. Does anyone have a question to get us going or an observation?
Well, I think as you were saying that, I kind of remembered what we had been talking about before. So now I can kind of pick up and run with what Micah was saying, because we were talking in the past about how one of Ivan's defining characteristics that gets brought out early in the novel is that he hates the fact that he's dependent, right? Like, he hates the fact that he has to ask people for money. So he's literally a sponger himself for much of his life. But then we just had the line in the last chapter where Smerdyakov is like, dude, you just want to live your own life and like not have to be dependent on anybody. So it's like the devil is almost this like exaggerated, ridiculous version of the part of himself that he like fears most. Maybe that's what you were saying before, Micah, because like I could see that connection, right? Like all his life, Ivan has just wanted to be free, not rely on anybody, be his own person. So when Satan shows up, he's a kind of shabby sponger, like the thing Ivan fears and has not wanted to come true for himself. He doesn't want to have to sing for his supper. He wants to tell anybody anything he wants about the courts whenever he wants, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah, and there's something about the way Ivan describes the devil in, you know, in the Grand Inquisitor, the great dread spirit of non-existence, i.e. one that does not produce in and of himself, right? So therefore he would have to attach himself. Right, he would have to piggyback off something else.
I also think it's fascinating, Melissa, what you just said about the devil being the parts of himself that he hates most. Like I feel like that's probably true for a lot of people. Like, you know, you think about not necessarily like an external devil, but I mean, inner demons are sort of, you know, the parts of ourselves that we dislike and that we struggle with. And here he's kind of hallucinating this external being.
My devil's aspirational. It's everything I wish I was.
Hey, McG, your mic was off, so I could hear you were trying to say something, but nobody else could.
Yeah. I was like, why is Ginny interrupting me? I was like, oh, whoops. Her point was a lot better than mine. I was just going to point out how the devil repeatedly points out to Yvonne that Yvonne is especially irritated with him because he didn't come with some kind of grand appearance, and like he's like, you're angry that I'm not coming here with, you know, flames and fire and all this stuff, aren't you? Like you really wanted a grand show, and it's like just really disappointing when the devil turns out to be, you know, like a kind of annoying uncle, you know.
I think it's interesting too to like hop to what Ginny was saying. Like, I feel this in the context of Dostoevsky in this novel, this chapter really leaves open the question: is Yvonne just having some kind of psychological breakdown and projecting, or not? Right? Is there something really satanic or demonic? And I also like this. I want to point out, we didn't talk about that. One of the things Lise talks about in her meltdown chapter is having this image of like this nightmare where all the demons are like coming up to her, right? And then she does the sign of the cross and they back off, and then she does something horrible, so they creep up on her more, which I found that to be one of the equally terrifying images.
I forgot.
But then we also have Father Farapont. Like, we have this repetition of all of these characters who have seen demons, and I'm getting tired, so I don't know that I can make a brilliant connection there, but it seems like there's something going on, right? Like if Yvonne's talking to Lise and now she's got this weird thing about demons going on too. But I do think it's interesting. It's like, is this just a psychological projection, which Yvonne wrestles with too, right? There's all these times where he's like, well, you said that because I think that, and then wait, but I never thought that. Like, that's so fascinating.
Jason just got cooties, by the way. I underlined, you know, at what level do I take this literally or to take this, you know, metaphysically? Because they're all right at the age to have, like, you know, their dad was nuts. They're at the right age where one after the next, if it's something like schizophrenia or something, they would have a break, you know, one after the next, probably at about that age they're all at. I really enjoyed when the devil knew how long it took the sun to get to the earth. I was like, oh, they knew that then. But
that was pretty cool.
A little throwaway, but I was really obsessed with without me, there's no event. And I was like, is this all human weakness? Is this the weakness within each of us? Is it the intersection of the two that creates everything there is on earth that's interesting? It's all of our devil.
I think there's a lot of interaction going on in this chapter with the Grand Inquisitor,
yeah,
and Rebellion chapters, and for instance, here we have the idea of a sort of grand finale restoration resolution where you know, even the rebellious and Satan himself will be saved, and they'll all sing hallelujah. They'll shout hallelujah. And there's this interesting story where the devil really wants to, when he sees Christ ascending with the thief on the cross, you know, and he's like really getting caught up in the moment. And he's like, every part of me wanted to shout hallelujah. But I realized it was like, you know, beneath the dignity of my office or something like that. And so I had to restrain myself, and I've like regretted it ever since, you know. But the part that Aaron was just talking about without the devil there'd be no events, I do think that idea ties back a little bit to Yvonne's questions in Rebellion. Here the devil is the embodiment of the idea that evil is a necessary part of God's plan, you know, that, and in fact, in this chapter, the devil is actually appointed by some sort of cosmic order to create chaos and stuff so that events happen, you know, so that everything isn't boring. And that would be, you know, the thing that Yvonne had to reject in Rebellion, that he was, you know, like railing at God against would be, why would you build all this suffering and stuff into your order? And of course, the classic theological response would have been, those weren't necessary to the order. Those weren't created by God. But in this chapter, they are. So this devil is kind of the living embodiment of the theology that Ivan expressed in Rebellion. And there's, you know, moments where he's sort of quoting Ivan's stories mockingly back to him.
The part where the devil says that, like, basically the metaphysical is humiliated, that we're cracking the code with science, I think would support that.
I also really noticed the part where he starts taunting Yvonne, and Yvonne's like, I don't believe you really. He's like, don't believe it then. Like, what good is faith by force? Proofs aren't any help to faith. You don't need miracles, right? Like, literally throwing everything back in his face, but now using it to sort of like make fun of Yvonne's psychosis. That part really cracked me up and felt like a really direct callback to everything in Rebellion and the Grand Inquisitor's whole idea that, like, fine, we'll give them miracles. And this devil's like, fine, no miracles for you then. Maybe you're just crazy, right? Like, I don't know. I thought that was funny.
Another thing is, I love that the devil himself has a crisis of faith. He's like, I'm not sure if I believe in God. I want to. Like, actually, my favorite part of the whole chapter is that the devil's repeatedly expressed desire that the one thing he truly wants in the world is to be a 250-pound woman lighting a candle, you know, before an icon, like, with faith. That's what he really wants to be. And I love that he talks about their world and their parallels. So they also have, like, the merchants' wives on their order. They also gossip, but it's a little bit worse. And
I was picturing the translator converting the units of measure there, and I was having a good laugh.
Yeah.
So good looking.
To go back in the conversation just a minute to the part about without the devil there wouldn't be any events or anything happening. I think that's a universal idea. I mean, obviously it shows up in lots of religions, but also, I don't know, secular philosophy. The idea that in order to know what happiness is, you have to be sad sometimes. Like, everything can't just be good all the time, or else you wouldn't know what good was. And sort of following that to its logical conclusion, you know, if there's going to be any difference in all so that some things are better, well, then you kind of have to have extremes. I think that's kind of a universal philosophical idea. It doesn't really answer the problem of evil, but it's a way of looking at it.
And he, I mean, the devil flat out tells them I underline here, the unscrupulous benefited, because what is remorse of conscience to a man who has no conscience at all? Decent people who still have some conscience and honor left suffered instead. You know, basically straight up says all this that we've been dancing around this whole time. When all is allowed, jerks take advantage. Like, the devil just straight up says it. I cause events, and if you get rid of morality, Murdakov is going to kill your dad, or his dad, or both your dads. That's an event.
How about the story of the atheist who dies and is really irritated to find himself in an afterlife? And then, like, his punishment is you're gonna have to walk a quadrillion miles, you know, and then you'll be accepted into bliss. And, like, he lays there for 1,000 years, and then finally gets up and walks, and goes, and he gets there, and within 2 seconds of being there, he's like, these 2 seconds are worth quadrillion times quadrillion years. And this is the really funny part, is a couple of people who are already there are like, in short, he sang Hosanna and oversweetened it so much that some persons there of a nobler cast of mind did not even want to shake hands with him at first. he jumped over to the conservatives a bit too precipitously. Which is evidently a story that Ivan made up when he was a kid.
Yeah.
Although this is a thread that's kind of been a undertone throughout the book is the question of universal salvation. And I wonder how much Dostoevsky himself might have espoused that view, which is a sort of minority thread in the history of theology too. But there it is in Ivan's Devil chapter.
I liked on 649 when he basically, sings a John Lennon song of "It's the world without God," and then immediately is like, "But you're all too stupid for this." I like how the devil would set these things up and then ham-fistedly just slam the door shut immediately after the start of all of his little stories or anecdotes. In view of man's stupidity.
Yeah, that 648, 649 is really kind of brutal, where he's like, here's all your ideas, and just throwing them right in his face. And I like the end conclusion after going through Ivan's kind of entire philosophy that justifies everything is permitted. He's like, it's all very nice. Only if one wants to swindle, why, I wonder, should one also need the sanction of truth? But such is the modern little Russian man. As a kid who grew up Lutheran also, I absolutely loved the moment when he throws the ink bottle at the devil, which is an actual event from Luther's life. And and the devil kind of calls him out on it. He remembered Luther's inkstand. I guess the question I have to ask is, what is the point of this whole chapter? Is there a serious point to this? Is this just entertainment? Is this just showing us Ivan's going crazy? Is this the devil is actually the best critic of Ivan's ideas? And, the devil himself is giving, I don't know. It's kind of, the author spends a lot of time on this chapter, Why?
Well, I mean, I do think when you pointed out on 648, where Ivan is groaning about how all of his ideas are being thrown back in his face, which sounds horrible, and also like whether or not this is a real devil or his own mind. Yeah, that's about how my mind likes to torture me too. So, he's literally being forced to relive. But interestingly, I feel like this whole chapter has been and I didn't catch this till now, but this whole chapter has been about how his ideas have caused pain to other people, right? Have driven them to suffering. And now I feel like we are being shown in detail Ivan's old ideas coming up, being fleshed out, taken to their logical conclusion by the devil, as you and Aaron were saying, sort of set up, shown to be ridiculous. And we're I feel like we're seeing him being tortured by his own ideas. Yeah. So I feel like there is some serious point to it. It's not just being witty. It's showing that these ideas can be taken to extreme and painful conclusions, but the opposite, right? We had the actually disturbingly painful conclusions that Lise took them to, or the murderous conclusions, and now we have kind of ridiculous ones. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there's seriousness to this chapter and point to making it so long. It's not just entertainment. I mean, bits of it were really funny, but bits of it were also extremely disturbing. And you know, very, very philosophical and I mean, building a little bit on what Melissa said. I mean, we've throughout the book kind of followed Yvonne back and forth on different contradictory ideas, and you know, kind of had the notion that he says all these things that he may or may not actually believe, and having everything thrown back at him by this devil just kind of brings that all to a head in a sense.
Was anybody else sad after the devil kind of make fun of the Grand Inquisitor poem? When the devil goes, well, and what about the geological cataclysm? Remember that? What a poem. Was anyone else sad that we don't have Yvonne's geological cataclysm poem?
Oh, I kind of thought that's what that next passage was.
Yeah, me too.
Wait, what? So
what? Because he says that once mankind has renounced God, one and all, and I believe that this period, analogous to the geological periods, will come.
Oh, okay. So that's
the entire old world.
I missed that. Thank you. So the whole idea that everyone will reach this enlightenment of living without God and taking care of each other, or if they don't, now we're entitled because we're the ones who know. We can just kind of fast forward to that era. I missed that. Okay, so that is the poem.
Yeah. Also because Yvonne's like, oh, shut up or I'll kill you. He's like, kill you? No, I'll have my say. I'm going to tell you exactly what you said back then. So, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Well, I'm glad I asked.
I really enjoy all of the physical comedy with the devil. He gets rheumatism. He's flying around in his waistcoat. It's also really reminiscent of Fyodor starting out talking theologically about hell and getting distracted about like how they hang the hooks.
And does hell have a ceiling or whatever?
Yeah.
Well, they reference that too, right? At one point, he's like taunting him when he's remembering that story about the guy that laid down. He's like, well, what was he laying on? Was he laying on something?
This might just be my weird brain, but in the detailed description at the beginning of the chapter of like the tailored suit and the everything and how he was, you know, like a little shabby, but like pretty much well dressed, you know, devil type character. It made me think of the portrayal of the devil in Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus. I don't know if anybody else has seen that movie. But it's like the devil in that movie is very much like fancy suit and little tiny pencil mustache and bowler hat and cigarette.
One of my favorite moments is when the devil was cured of his like chest rheumatism or whatever problems it was he got from flying through space without a good enough jacket on. And he got cured by drinking some malt extract, and which I loved as a brewer, first of all. And then like he wanted to write a letter of gratitude to get published, but no one would publish a letter of gratitude from the devil. It's and what I really loved after all the Rakitin stuff was that would like be against their tendency in the paper or whatever, you know, it'd have the wrong tendency.
I also feel like this passage was significant because it's basically undermining the last bit of hope that Yvonne is going to do some big noble thing, right? Or I mean, I don't know if it's undermining it or not. And I'm not just covering, I honestly don't remember what Yvonne does after this. But right, we saw him say, I'm going to go right now to the prosecutor. And then no, he doesn't. And then that's one of the first things that happens. And the devil is like, in his funny French that he keeps bringing up, he's like, oh, your decision. That's so noble. That's so charming. How cute, right? Like he's making fun of Yvonne to the point that it seems like it's just another way to try and get out of this, right? Like making this noble effort seem like just a stupid little like noble idea that won't mean anything. So it seems again that seems parallel to so much that's going on in the book, where we have the simple characters like Alyosha, and they're looked down on. And here we have someone who literally had a generous impulse, but it seems too simple, too quaint, and so now he's going to get distracted by these weird ideas for pages and pages and pages, rather than doing what seemed like a good thing to do.
If only we had the official Percotin to help. Have you guys gotten everything out that you want to say about the devil?
I think it's a very good point that, like, in this same section, because you see Lies and you see Smerdyakov and then you see Ivan's devil, how Dostoevsky is not portraying in any way, shape, or form a simple version of evil, because Ivan's devil really is not evil incarnate. It's evil attaching itself to Ivan. You know, it's not really the devil in the sense that this is the devil filtered through Ivan, regardless if it's really the devil or just an insane whatever, because this devil has good taste. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, there's so much taste. You know, I mean, even though the devil is terrifying in the Ivan conversation, I feel like it's not, you know, like, at the same time, like, there's a certain sensibleness to it. There's a certain charm to it almost. Because even though he's wearing the outdated clothes, he's still wearing them, you know, as tastefully as he can. And yet, you know, and then there's, you know, Smerdyakov and Lies, where there's this destructiveness to it. So I think that the beautiful thing is that he is trying to portray evil kind of in these very diverse ways, but not so much as a personality, but something that works through people. And I think he's trying to show kind of how there's this thing out there that does have a certain flavor to it, but it's going through a very different prism in each of these different people as it's manifesting. Because I don't think people who would read this would think of the devil in this thing, even though it's like the best written devil. I don't think they would think of it as the epitome of evil either.
Yeah, well, the devil himself says that he wants to do good, and he's sort of forced against his will, or accidentally, you know, does evil. And I'm thinking a little bit about Ivan and the Grand Inquisitor, and, you know, some parallels to Ivan in that, like, all these ideas are supposed to be for good, and he wants to take, you know, responsibility to make man happy or whatever, the best way that he's able to. But all of Ivan's ideas have led to nothing but destruction, you know. So Ivan himself is sort of the one somehow seeking good to some extent in these philosophies and ideas, and theories. But he's had a, you know, he ends up being a kind of tempter towards destruction himself.
Hey, I really hate to leave because this conversation's awesome, but I got to get up early to get stuff ready for school tomorrow. So I'm going to put myself to bed, everybody, and I'll watch the rest of the conversation later.
Cheers to my
Melissa.
Cheers to my sister and Norm.
Yes.
And with that, I think we can move on to the last chapter, which I didn't read, so someone else will take the lead here.
Oh wait, I had a sound effect ready. Hold on. Plot twist. Smerdyakov hangs himself.
So it's such a riotous comedy up to now, and then it's like, oh no.
This was one of the first moments in the plot, because the book moves at such a methodical pace. Is Smiryakov's suicide actually caught me a little bit by surprise. It probably shouldn't have, but I went, oh, wow, this complicates things.
Oh, well, crap.
The essence here is that Alyosha comes in. He finds Ivan, either having this out-of-body experience or metaphysical experience, or having a mental breakdown, fit, or both, and tries to take care of him. To varying degrees of not being successful at that.
There were two things that struck me about this chapter. The first was we find out that the devil, whatever the whole experience of the last chapter, wasn't, an actual real person in the actual real room, which, I mean, we kind of knew, but we find out that in the last chapter, he talks about Ivan put a wet towel on his head and he threw a glass, and the towel is dry, the glass isn't broken. In the physical real world, it's like the last chapter didn't happen. So I think that's significant. And then the second thing that I found significant about this is the realization that Smerdyakov being dead changes the likely outcome of Ivan going to testify tomorrow. I don't know if I have anything profound to say about either of those things, but they're there.
When he talks of that, Ivan, he speaks of in words that are decisively not his philosophy from earlier. He's describing that it's being told to him, but he's saying, you will go, you will go, you know yourself that no matter how much you try to decide, the decision will no longer depend on you. So something external to yourself. You will go because you don't dare not to. You will go because you don't dare not to. Why you don't dare, you can guess for yourself. There's a riddle for you. He's talking about the devil speaking for him, and he's not refuting it. And I found it really fascinating. He was, recounting what the devil said to him and not refuting it, and allowing this external force to speak for him in some way.
A minor moment that jumped out to me is that he says, I'm looking for it now, to Alyosha, I love your face, right? As kind of a non sequitur, which he, way back in Rebellion or one of their earlier conversations, he specifically says, it's impossible to love someone, especially you start loving them and then you look at their face and they're just they look like an idiot. It's a terrible face. I hate. As soon as you encounter someone, it was part of that. As soon as you encounter someone in real life and they're no longer abstract, you can't love them specifically anymore. So something has changed in Ivan, aside from just going pretty much full Father Farapont.
I'm sorry that I didn't get through this one. I don't have any good questions or anything. I'm not sure how much there is to say about it. So you guys tell me when when the conversation is done, because I don't even remember what happened. So.
I mean, that's why it's only a few pages long. It ends with Alyosha putting Ivan to bed and praying for him.
praying repeatedly for him.
Mhm.
God will win, he thought. He will either rise to the light of truth or perish in hatred, taking revenge on himself and everyone for having served something he does not believe in. And again prayed for Ivan.
Yeah, what does Alyosha mean there? Like, trying to read that literally, it seems kind of uncharacteristically grim from Alyosha. Like, I think there was like an old T-shirt when I was young, that was one of those sassy T-shirts that people wear. And it had like the quote like "God is dead, Nietzsche," and then below that it said "Nietzsche is dead, God." The idea being that like God always wins. Either like, and in this case, it's either Ivan will, he will either embrace godliness and be fine, or he will not embrace godliness and he's going to have a really, really tough time of it. And in either case, you can't. The house always wins, as it were. It's not a kindly thought.
Yeah, I'm not sure how God wins in the second scenario, where Ivan perishes in hatred and takes revenge on everyone.
I like. Is it just a little bit, as Micah was saying with Smerdyakov? It's just you can't live in that terrible way. You can't live against God. It's unsustainable. But it's not a pretty picture. I don't know. Yeah, that was a strange way to end it.
Suspense builder, I think. Oh, sorry.
That's also with the point about whether or not it's sustainable. It's not just true like on the like individual level. It also is true kind of on the greater. It's also true on like the greater social level. Like for example, one of the things I always am reminded of is like if you talk to I can't think Golding, like Golding even said, even though his inspiration was teaching a boys debate team, he even said in different lectures he was sometimes thinking about Karamazov when he was writing Lord of the Flies. And like I think that like when you look at that book, it just shows that like the beast is not a sustainable thing, right? Like when humankind gets really self-destructive, it just doesn't work. Like, and so like you literally have to be something else in order to. And so I feel like the thing I almost wondered about this was Alyosha being fatalistic. You know what I mean? Like, well, either he'll live or he won't, and he just kind of just surrenders it. And I always wondered in that if Alyosha, because that seemed so different to me about Alyosha, who would bleed his last drop of blood like for his brother before. I was wondering what that was about, and I was wondering if anyone felt like this was a slight difference than the earlier Alyosha.
Maybe a slight difference, but I think what struck me when I first read it before this conversation was the consistency of Alyosha's prayer, which is not a difference, not a odd thing for Alyosha's character. I saw it more as he's acknowledging that he doesn't know that everything's going to turn out fine and rosy and happy. And, maybe it shows a little bit of a deviation, but I think only in kind of being disillusioned. Like, our father was murdered. All this shit is happening. All these, weird relationships and craziness and illness and suicide and everything is happening. It's not necessarily going to be all rosy. I'm worried about my brother. All I can do is pray. And to me, that's very in character for Alyosha.
Yeah, I wonder if the God will win is an expression of hope tied to his prayer and the first half of the either or, you know, and not necessarily the second half. Rather than an absolute certainty.
I think it's good suspense building as well, because like I want to take another drink now. Because I was like, well, what does that look like? What do both sides of this look like? What does that mean for Dimitri? What does that mean for Ivan? What does that mean for God and Alyosha? I need to read on.
And read on we will. I think this can be the end of the discussion if you guys are okay with that. So thank you for another very productive one, and a lot of insights that I would have missed on my own. So I will just mention that next week's reading, book 12, is actually the last book before the epilogue, and it is huge. And so it's split into two. So we are not reading the entire next book. There's a stopping point in an old email somewhere that tells you how far to read if you still have that syllabus. And if not, I can send that out again. So I'll try to send an email saying how far to actually go, because this is a huge chunk. And we end up getting 2 lawyers' speeches. So I think we're just reading the first. So with that, I will say good night, close our broadcast down, and we can chat if anyone wants to. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.